Welcome to Chip War, the first jointly produced webinar by Intel Alumni Network and Intel Corporation. I'm happy to welcome CEO Pat Gelsinger to kick off today's event. Pat, you have the floor.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Carl, and great to see you. Great to have those in the Alumni Network joining us, and a super interesting topic. And about 38 years ago, I think it was, when we were just starting up the 386 project. Carl's old enough to remember that. But I remember at the time that, Jim Slager, who some of you might remember, comes walking into my office and hands me this Pulitzer Prize winning book at the time about the design battle at Data General that was going on. And he hands me the book and he says, "Read it. You're living it." Right. And I remember at the time, it's sort of like, wow, I didn't realize it. And, all the things that were going on, the 386, the 432, what became the 960 project, but a book that was chronicling the environment that we found ourselves in. And the book, of course, Tracy Kidder's a great book at the time, and one that I quite enjoyed, for many years thereafter. When I first picked up the book Chip War by Chris Miller, that exact thought crossed my mind. Read it to everybody at Intel, because we are living it. We're in the middle of this seminal period of history where we're rebuilding the technology supply chains of the world. And as I've said, where the oil reserves are has defined geopolitics for the last 5 decades. Where the technology supply chains are is more important for the next 5 decades. Let's build them where we want them. And it's somewhat in that context that I think Chris's, and he'll certainly give you in his own words, he didn't start out writing Chip War, right? But the understanding of how Chip War, came about and how it chronicles the world that we at Intel, as we're rebuilding not just the company, rebuilding its position in the technology industry, but also rebuilding the technology supply chains of the world. And I think you're going to super enjoy the conversation today. Chris and I have done a couple of interviews together over time, and have really benefited from his research and work. And I'm looking forward to Chip War Part 2, and one that we're looking forward to him writing in a few years. So back to you, Carl, and thank you for letting me join you all today.
Thanks, Pat. I really appreciate your comments and your taking time to start the event off today. I know it means everything to all the Intel employees as well as the Intel alumni. So thank you much, and we'll see you again soon. Please note, everyone, that we are now live worldwide with participants from Intel Alumni Network and Intel employees. Before we get started, let me cover some housekeeping items. First, on questions and answers. Intel employees, using your smartphone, please scan the QR code in the lower right-hand corner of the screen to submit your questions. Intel alumni, please use the same process. We will go to audience questions immediately after my kickoff round of questions for each of our panel members concludes. If you are unable to attend or want to review the proceedings, Intel will post an available link later this week on the internal Intel website. For Intel alums, it will be available at www.intelalumni.org. It is certainly my pleasure to host the event today, and I would especially like to thank Intel and the Intel Alumni Network people who have worked closely together to produce this first-of-a-kind joint online event. A truly great example of risk-taking. It is my pleasure to host the event today, and I would especially like to thank Intel and the Intel Alumni Network people who have worked closely together to produce this online event. And from Intel, that would be Max Torres, Kimberly Samarja, Sumitra Sukumaran, Danielle Goodwin, Penny Bevins, And from Intel Alumni Network, many thanks to James Cape and the IAN Board of Directors for continuing their efforts to produce engaging and thoughtful online events. I really appreciate the time and effort our panelists put in preparing for the event. It is certainly a topic worthy of discussion. Please welcome Jim Evers, Vice President, Ohio Site Manufacturing and Operations Manager, Stu Pann, Senior Vice President and General Manager of Intel Foundry Services, and Al Thompson, Vice President of Intel Government Affairs. Our special guest today is Chris Miller, author of Chip War. Chris, thank you for your time today. You have written an outstanding book on the history and the future of the semiconductor industry. I enjoyed reading it and recommend everybody buy a copy and give it a read. Only once in a long while does such a book come along that is so timely and has so many important strategic implications. Thank you for highlighting and educating us all on the strategic competition we are facing today. Not only is the mantle of industry leadership at stake going forward, the very security of nations is in the balance. It reminds me of two books and their authors that had great impact on Intel strategy during my time at the company. Michael Porter's Competitive Strategy and Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma. Andy Grove passed these two books around to executive staff members with the request that we think about our business responsibilities within the models presented by these two authors. Chip War represents a similar opportunity for reflection on Intel strategy. The next era of competition in the semiconductor industry will bring an old procurement ally into the fray. Governments around the world will insert themselves as never before. They have always been involved, but now there is consensus on the importance of semiconductors economically, technologically, and for national security. If I think about the model implied by Chris's work, governments will have to step up their involvement to a new level of partnership with Intel. At the same time, the US government will need to engage in reforms that focus on technical innovation while reforming the federal procurement process. I am pleased now to turn over the floor to Chris Miller for his opening remarks to start us off today. Chris, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Carl, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Pat, for kicking off this conversation. And thanks to the entire Intel and Intel alumni team for the invitation to join you all today. When I was researching my book, I had the great honor of speaking with many Intel alumni who are scattered all over the semiconductor industry, who actually defined in many ways the history of the semiconductor industry. And so I've learned much from speaking with many of your colleagues over the past several years as I researched and wrote Chip War. What I'd like to suggest today, first off, looking historically, is that Intel is the most important company of the last 50 years. And I say that not only because I know there are many current and former employees of Intel on this call, but because I think it's historically true. And second, what I'd like to suggest to you is that the future of the capabilities that Intel has played a central role in developing of computing power will be critical to the balance of economic, technological, and also security over the coming half century. Now, it might seem like a somewhat grandiose claim to argue that Intel is the most important company of the last 50 years. But I think I can fairly straightforwardly convince you that it's true, because the most transformative force across the entire world over the past half century has undeniably been the development of Moore's law, which of course, as all of you know, is not actually a law of nature, but rather a prediction made by one of the co-founders of Intel, Gordon Moore, now over half a century ago, almost 60 years ago now. And Moore's law has persisted in no small part thanks to Intel. which has been one of the companies that has invested very heavily over the past half century in driving Moore's law forward. And within the semiconductor industry, Moore's law is often taken for granted because people like you know that it's been accomplished and know what it's taken to push it forward. But in the context of the rest of the economy, and indeed the rest of all of human life, Moore's law is simply unprecedented. There's nothing else in the history of economics that has managed to double every 2 years for such a long duration of time. Nothing else comes remotely close. In most businesses, if you grow your productivity by a couple percentage points a year, you've accomplished success. Economies in aggregate grow by a couple percentage points a year. Total factor productivity across the US economy grows by 1, 2, or 3 percentage points a year, depending on the year. And yet the chip industry has managed to double the number of transistors per chip and thus the computing capabilities per chip almost every other year now for over half a century. And if you think of the painfully slow rates of improvement of all other types of technology, the extraordinary things that the chip industry has accomplished begin to become clearer. And to put this into context, I like to think about the aviation industry, which on the one hand is an example of pretty cool high-tech stuff. Planes can fly. That manages to astound my 3-year-old son on a regular basis. And indeed, when we're sitting on airplanes, we often take for granted the fact that they can fly. But there's been no improvements in aviation anywhere close to the improvements we've gotten in computing power. I like to ask, well, what would the speed of planes be if they doubled every 2 years over the past half century like computing power has done? Well, they'd be at 6 times the speed of light. It's physically impossible for aviation to produce that level of improvements, but the chip industry has done it. And if you look across all other types of technology, all other facets of the economy, nothing else has come close to the rate of improvements driven by Moore's law, which is why the capabilities that Moore's law has made possible have been applied to every other facet of the economy. The chip industry has been colonizing the rest of the economy, taking over the world because everyone needs the capabilities that it alone can provide: computing, sensing, communications, which has transformed basically every segment of the economy in basically every country. And so when I argue to you that Intel is perhaps the most important company that's existed, I think you'll begin to understand why I think that. Because not every company can claim to have influenced Intel, but Intel can plausibly claim to have played a central role in driving forward the technological advances that today every single person and every single company relies on. I think one of the great failings of the chip industry over the past several decades has been to not realize just how wild, magical, and cool it is to undertake the type of accomplishments that the chip industry takes. People in your position are just accustomed to taking for granted exponential growth rates without thinking about how extraordinary it is in the context of the rest of our lives. Before I began studying the semiconductor industry, I'd only seen exponential growth rates in math class, which is the only other part of human existence that has regular exponential growth curves. And yet the chip industry delivers them on a regular basis. It's so second nature to people on this Teams call that you don't even think about how extraordinary it is. And so what I would first like to encourage you all to do is to take a step back and just wonder at the extraordinary accomplishments that the semiconductor industry and Intel specifically have helped produce over the past half century, because I think you can't understand any of the key developments in recent history without putting the development of computing capabilities absolutely at the center of that analysis. And that's true not only when it comes to things we think of when we think of technology, smartphones, PCs, data centers, the internet. It's also true when we think about bigger social forces, which themselves have been transformed by technology that semiconductors have enabled. One of the reasons why I decided to write Chip War was when I began to realize that semiconductors weren't only important for my PC or for my smartphone, but they were important to understand all of the key global trends that were unfolding on a daily basis in newspaper headlines all around the world. For example, when I learned that today China spends as much money each year importing semiconductors as it spends importing oil, I realized that you can't understand the structure of globalization without putting semiconductors at the center. And I think that single data point puts very clearly into context Pat's argument about semiconductors being as important as oil. Well, in terms of trade data, that's just a fact. Semiconductors are just as important as oil for several of the world's largest economies. And so if you look at big shifts in the world economy, semiconductors have been a fundamental driver of the success and the failure of not just companies, but also entire national economies. And indeed, when you look at the ways that globalization is changing, again, here too, semiconductors are at the center. Second, I came to realize the way that semiconductors have played a central role in the production of military power. As Carl mentioned, there's been a deep interrelationship between the development of computing capabilities and national security implications. And indeed, if you go back to the early history of Intel, indeed the prehistory of Intel, when Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore were at Fairchild Semiconductor, which they'd founded before going on to found Intel, there was a very deep and intimate relationship between that company and the early space race and the early Cold War national security state. And indeed, it wasn't a coincidence, I don't think, that that Fairchild got off the ground in no small part by selling semiconductors that went into guidance computers that were used in space and in missile systems. And although today companies in the semiconductor industry generally focus most of their sales on civilian products like computers, like data centers, like smartphones, it's still the case that a key demand for semiconductors comes from military and security applications, and having access to the most advanced computing capabilities, the most advanced sensing and communications capabilities is absolutely fundamental for defense and intelligence agencies, especially as they increasingly try to grapple with use cases of artificial intelligence. So just like in the early days of Intel's co-founders, I think today as well, when you talk to officials in the defense and intelligence world, they see semiconductors as not just important for civilian technologies, but also as critical for national security implications. And indeed, as Pat and Carl both alluded to, today the entire world is beginning to reshape the way that it produces semiconductors, as nearly every country and nearly every government have become concerned with questions of supply chain resilience and of the geopolitical balance that semiconductors play a role in. That'll come as no surprise to anyone on this Teams call that the manufacturing of semiconductors has gotten extraordinarily concentrated in a small number of companies and in a small number of countries. And when you look across the world, as the US, Europe, Japan, Korea, India, and many other governments are trying to engage with the semiconductor industry, a key focus that you see is diversification and supply chain resilience as being two central themes of government policy. And governments are interested in these two topics because they realize that semiconductors are as important as they've ever been, not only for their security ramifications, but also for their broader economic ramifications. And I think as a final point to wrap up on, the fact that semiconductors are being applied to a ever broader sphere of devices makes them ever more central today in comparison to several decades ago. The pandemic era chip shortages, I think, helped people understand the extent to which today almost every manufactured good has at least one and often dozens or hundreds of chips inside. Most people, even I think car company executives, were astounded to learn during the pandemic that a new car will often have 1,000 semiconductors inside. And that points to the extent to which the computing capabilities that chips enable have become pervasive. In every device, there are increasingly greater numbers of chips doing many different things, some very expensive, some very simple, but enabling all of the capabilities we rely on. I like to think about just the number of semiconductors I interact with over the course of my daily life, in my alarm clock, in my refrigerator, in my car, in my microwave. Even before I've picked up my smartphone, there are dozens, hundreds, probably even thousands of chips that I've touched, to say nothing about the chips that are in the telecoms infrastructure and the data centers that increasingly store and process all my data. And that's only possible. It's only possible to have chips in all of these different devices because the cost of compute has been relentlessly driven downwards. And it's been relentlessly driven downwards because of Moore's law. And so when I say that Intel, which has been the driving force behind Moore's Law for half a century, is the most important company to understand the history of the last 50 years, that's exactly what I mean. Because the central trend in the development of computing, which is Moore's Law, more powerful, more cost-effective compute, has been important far beyond this one company. Transformative though it's been for Intel, it's been important for everything, because all of the devices that I use that rely on computing power have benefited from the extraordinary advances in semiconductor design and manufacturing that have enabled Moore's Law. And so I think when the semiconductor industry and when Intel looks at the role that it plays in the world, I think the entire chip industry can do more to recognize its absolutely central importance. I think Pat's right when he says that chips are the oil of the 21st century. It's actually more true than I think that statement gives credit to, because oil is useful for certain parts of the economy, for cars, for example, for providing energy, but chips are in almost everything. And so I think it's certainly right to say that chips will be the critical technology of the 21st century. I think they already are the critical technology of the 20th century, and recognizing and focusing on and streamlining and diversifying the ways that they're produced and the places they're produced, I think will remain a central focus of both industry and of government policymakers for many years to come. So thank you, Carl, for the invitation to join you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Great. Well, I thank you for painting a wonderful mosaic picture of the importance of our products, our company, and the industry to the world. And, you know, the last 50 years have been phenomenal. And you think about what we have today, I can't imagine or couldn't wait for the next 50 years. There's going to be some really incredible stuff that the people at Intel are going to be front and center on delivering. So thanks, Chris, and we'll move on here to the questions so that I have for our panel members, and we'll be back to you in a couple of minutes with a question. The winners in this competitive race will be companies who are most effective in building, filling, running, and repeating state-of-the-art semiconductor factories. Yes, that's right, repeat, because there will be another generation of advanced semiconductor manufacturing after EUV. This promises to be a competitive cycle without end. And my first question goes to Al Thompson. Al, I've always been passionate about hearing from our people who face the customer every day. You are in a unique position. You see US policymakers as your customer every day. And build means it takes capital to play in this competition. The White House recently announced 460 companies have expressed interest in the $50 billion CHIP Act. That's good news, but if they each need $1 billion, we are short funding by an order of magnitude. Will the US government be competitive with the Chinese government? I'm curious, will Congress invest in state-of-the-art semiconductor wafer processing, round for round, with no strings attached?
So one, it's great to be here, Carl. It's very interesting, kind of looking at this CHIPS Act journey from my vantage point, and particularly the amount of advocacy that Pat and Stu and others have done to put us in the position. I'll answer that question a couple of ways, right? I think one, the reason why the U.S. government basically passed the CHIPS Act and then the CHIPS and Science Act post-COVID was a recognition of, as Chris said, the value and the critical role that semiconductors play for both economic and national security. And I think they realized that it is a global competition. They were very concerned about the over-concentration of manufacturing in Asia. I would say it's broader than just China. And I think they decided we need to come with a whole of government approach to basically incentivize and drive more manufacturing here, to the research apparatus of not only the Commerce Department, but the Department of Defense, to look at ways to continue to innovate. And then I think finally to look at ways to leverage the supply chain, because our supply chain is very global, to ensure that we are partnering with key allies across the world to ensure that we create more supply chain resiliency and balance. So I think we're going to be very competitive. I will say one of the things that CHIPS did spur that Chris mentioned that we highlighted a lot when we were pushing for the passage of the Chips and Science Act is this is now a global competition for incentives, right? It's not just India, it's Japan, South Korea, who in Taiwan, you could argue, had generous policies already in place, have increased what they're already doing. The EU is now implementing their CHIPS Act. And so I think, like it or not, we are in a race to ensure you can secure end-to-end supply chain resiliency and manufacturing of semiconductors on your shores. And that's a good thing. I think as it relates to the 460 companies and the $200 billion of investment that the CHIPS Science Act has spurred, I like to say I'll take Intel's hand any day of the week. I think, Chris highlighted the importance of Intel, but I can tell you, and I think it was, I know Pat shared some stories when he was at the State of the Union, but to hear the President of the United States essentially say Intel's an essential company, I think says a lot. We take our responsibility in trying to work to secure our funds and win this competition pretty seriously. But again, I think we have a unique role, a set of assets that nobody else in the industry has, and I think we're going to leverage those to hopefully get the funding that we need. I will say, there's never government funding without strings attached. Right? That doesn't happen. But the nice thing about the funding in the CHIPS and Science Act are the strings that they're attaching are all to Intel's benefit. Right? Intel is the one company, I believe, that's applying for CHIPS funding that can essentially achieve all of the different objectives that Secretary Raimondo and the president have laid out for the program. So our strings that they're attaching in terms of workforce development, diversity and inclusion, environmental impact, all work in our favor. So this is probably one of the few times where, are there strings? Yes. But the ones that they're attaching, we pretty much do on a daily basis as a company, and I think it's going to accrue to our benefit.
One of the things, Al, that Chris pointed out in his book was the development of the semiconductor equipment industry that supplies our needs for factories and so forth, being a diverse worldwide supply chain. We have important companies in Taiwan, Japan, the Netherlands, and so forth. It kind of raises a kind of a political aspect of that. And I just wonder if the U.S. government will actually see the potential of a worldwide deployment of this supply chain for semiconductor equipment as a path for a possible detente as tensions build among all the various bad actors, if you will, in the world, and the political tensions that we all hear about.
Yeah, I mean, I think one, there's a strong recognition, I think, that the U.S. government has learned probably in the last 15, 18 months about the global nature of the semiconductor supply chain, and frankly, the significant role that both the Japanese and the Dutch play. I'll tell one quick story just to kind of show how Intel's played a role in informing that. One of Pat's earlier meetings when in his tenure was with the National Security Advisor, and he basically walked him through the role that Japan and both the Netherlands play in the ecosystem, and made it clear that as you're looking at your policies, right, things have to be multilateral because of the role that they play. And I think, fortunately, the U.S. government's taken that to heart. I think they've been highly engaged with both the Dutch and the Japanese government on how you manage export controls to China, for example, which I think will be beneficial. But I go back to, again, one of the most undersold parts of the CHIPS and Science Act is the multilateral security fund. And what that really is the U.S. State Department is going to have about $500 million to spend over the next 5 years. And I think there's going to be opportunities to leverage the supply chain, the existing partnerships that can exist diplomatically to essentially, I think, try to troubleshoot and get ahead of future problems, right? That's one way. I think the other thing you see is that the EU and the United States have what's called the Trade and Technology Council. And while that covers a whole range of issues, semiconductors has played a role. And particularly, I think one of the things that we're pushing for is greater coordination as the EU and the US implement the CHIPS Act. So that's a long way of saying that I think, that cooperation is already happening. And I think there's a clear recognition now in the US government as they look at things geopolitically that we have to partner with our allies, and particularly Japan and the Netherlands as it relates to equipment and the supply chain in general.
Okay. So, I read a lot about, continuing discussion of amendments and changes to the CHIP Act. What is really going on in Washington today regarding the CHIP Act? What cabinet level member is responsible for driving the CHIP Act? Who do we go to as the top dog here that we can have a session with and get something done?
Multiple. No, I mean, I think as we look at it, the CHIPS Act is really kind of a 3-agency bill. I mean, the Commerce Department, number one, Secretary Gina Raimondo, who her team is basically implementing the law, but also reviewing all of the applications. So as Stu well knows, and Jim, we spend a lot of time with the CHIPS Program Office, who reports directly to her. She is a clear big deal. Believe it or not, the Department of Defense plays actually a really big role in CHIPS. First, there's R&D money set aside to basically start to drive innovation hubs around the country to support DoD initiatives. But the other thing that doesn't get talked about a lot that Stu is very involved in is in the original CHIPS Act, there's actually legislative policy designed to better align the Department of Defense's long-term semiconductor needs. Because one of the challenges that has presented itself is the fact that as weapons get more smarter and you need more chips, it's very expensive to manufacture those for the Department of Defense in a secure way. And so they have to leverage the commercial manufacturing process. I mean, I always kind of chuckle because one of the best parts of the book I thought was the telling of Bill Perry, who became a Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, but cut his teeth as the Undersecretary of Defense of Research and Engineering. And I can tell you, the Intel team led by IFS spends a lot of time with OSD R&D. And so I would say DoD is number two because of the role that they're going to play. And then again, it goes back to state. But to answer your question, we spend a lot of time with the Commerce Department because they oversee, I think, almost all of the funding for the bill. And I think, look, they are moving. Things are going to get done. I know Pat has shared that, we have essentially are on track to submit applications for what we're doing in Arizona, Ohio, New Mexico, and Oregon. I mean, I can promise you, my colleague, Greg Slater, Bruce, my boss, and others in the government affairs team, we spend a lot of time moving to answer their questions to hopefully get to a decision point. So that's one part. I think the other thing is you will start to see Congress focus on oversight of the program. I think the law is passed, it's been signed, the departments have been, I'm sure keeping the Hill abreast on kind of what's going on. But I think the thing you also will see is greater oversight as the funding starts to go out the door. And that's something that we're trying to, I think shape in a way that ensures that the issues that we want to be addressed get addressed, but you don't want to slow down or hinder the program, just given the global dynamic and the things that are going on in terms of the need to get more capacity online.
Great. It's good to hear that Commerce and Defense has their hand on the tiller. So hopefully that'll work out well for us. I'm going to move on to Stu now for some questions. Stu, fill means to me, frankly, fill. This looks like a sales opportunity in terms of the number of factories and the amount of spending you guys are committing to the factories. Empty or underutilized fab means losing to the competition. The x86 architecture is a strategic advantage for Intel because you have a demand for a large number of wafers to service x86. And x86 computers will be the bulldozers and the cranes that build out software for the two major markets that are developing in parallel right now that everybody's excited about, AI and VR. I want to understand if Intel has the will to not say no to any new consumer or infrastructure projects that the market may present to Foundry Services and commit wafer capacity to it.
Well, thanks for the question, Carl. I think, as many of the Intel Alumni Network knows, I was raised on the Carl Everett School of Management in terms of sales commitments. So when you make a commitment, you honor a commitment, and you follow through on that. And I think for us, what we're doing in IFS is we're pursuing a number of opportunities, but there's one area I'd like to just maybe expand a little bit in terms of talking about x86. Our focus in IFS is in more ways more focused on ARM than it is on x86, because today 80% of the wafers that run through TSMC's factories have an ARM microprocessor in that. And this is why, just a few months ago, you saw us announce a major partnership with ARM, which is something that in my first steward duty as I grew up with you and all the other people in the alumni network, the fact that we would embrace ARM as a company was just anathema. And now, pragmatically, to your point about filling factories, if we want to fill factories, if we want to compete with TSMC, we must have a viable partnership with ARM. They're shipping 9 billion units a quarter right now of licenses. So we will play with them. And when we commit to a customer, especially on the foundry side, it's a committed capacity corridor, because in order to be successful in the foundry business, it's first and foremost a trust business. If our customers don't trust to put their interests even ahead of our own business, they'll be reluctant to partner with us. So as we develop these relationships, we are going to these customers and saying, we will commit a quarter of capacity to you that's inviolate. It's yours. We're not going to go take away. So the reason you see, my supervisor going out and spending all the money he's spending is we want to make sure we have enough capacity in place, have the shells ready. I think many of the folks on the call remember Jerry Parker's laws, always be one shell ahead of the demand. This time, we're going to be multiple shells ahead of the demand, because we're going after some very significant volumes. And we'll work with the major players such that when we commit to something, we will honor it. Now, luckily, we're coming from a sales guy point of view with lots of opportunity, because we're not a major presence just yet. But we look to absolutely fill all those factories up over the coming years. And our goal is to be the #2 foundry by the end of the decade. And we have a roadmap laid out of processes and products and packaging and capacity to go do that. We know which customers buy, at that level, and we're courting them as hard as we possibly can. So I feel pretty good about our chances. The customer base wants an alternative to TSMC, as Chris alluded to earlier. There's a need for supply chain resiliency in the world. There's a need to rebalance where these kind of processes are running, and we offer that opportunity. To our customers, we also offer the opportunity to negotiate. Right? There's not much negotiation going on between TSMC and its customers right now. When they have 90% market segment share, they will, enforce their rules on this industry. And so the players in this industry want alternatives, want resiliency. And I think as we get to 5 nodes in 4 years, which we're absolutely marching toward, and have process superiority, in the coming next few years, we'll have another reason for the customers to come to us. So I like our chances, and we will not take, we're not turning down orders. ARM, x86 space, it doesn't matter to us. What matters is, the quality of the commitment and the, quality of the customer working with us to go bring that volume forward, because we can't take bets with customers unless they're going to be successful too. So we'll be careful, we'll be judicious, but we're also going to embrace, every major opportunity that we can.
Yeah, I think you're right on there. The trust has to be rebuilt, and the new business model has to be established. Okay, and you're going to need all the help you can get there from everybody, which brings me to kind of my next question. Our friends at the government, do you think you can work with governments to build creative incentives to have customers that haven't bought from us before? Okay. Take risk on Intel state-of-the-art wafers. For example, a nominal tax incentive for any customer who buys and accepts delivery of any product based on Intel state-of-the-art wafers would be a great signal from our friends in Congress. Okay. It's kind of like a potential for a Tesla moment. They certainly got behind electric vehicles. Why wouldn't they get behind semiconductors at the same level of weighting, okay, that they're behind electric vehicles if it's a national defense priority?
I would love for that to happen. And I think, in our late evening conversations that I had with Al and the other members of our DC team, we talk about that. But the reality is we have to deliver on CHIPS Act grants and money now. We have to show that it actually works. As Al mentioned, there's going to be a lot of oversight on this program. And there's also the usual, Republican, Democrat kind of debate back and forth as to what's better public policy. So there's a lot of eyes on this industry right now to actually show that this can work. And if it works and the money gets granted, we start building factories, I would hope that would be a logical next step, because as you and I both know, constraints come and go in this industry. And, we are incredibly concerned about constraints coming forward in the next 3 or 4 years, potentially due to, world economic situations. We need to have resilient supply chains. And when things get freer again, people sort of forget about that. And so any help in public policy to keep that moving forward, even though the tensions in the supply chain have somewhat dissipated, would be helpful. But, job one is get the grant money out now, get them applied to our factories, get our factories up and running, and then see where we can go from there.
Okay, great. Let me move on to Jim Evers for a couple of questions here. Jim, run means setting the speed at which the industry competes. How do you make Jerry Parker's elephant dance? After 50 years of proprietary wafer processing, you're now moving to a new open wafer processing model Stu was just describing. You still have a big order for x86 wafer starts. That's good news. The next challenge is responding to many new foundry customers and small lot wafer runs. Do you have a development underway and tools and process that handle the many diverse products and reticle changes that will be required?
Great. Thank you, Carl, for that one. Okay, before I answer that question, I just have a couple things I want to say. First, Chris, it's great to be with you here. I got your book about a year ago from my mother-in-law, and the page 2 of the cast of characters, Andy Grove was on there, and I read through it like a spy novel, and it was a go-to Christmas gift last year. So very, very relevant. And for the Intel alumni, thanks for having me back. I did a session with you last summer, so good to be back with you. We absolutely have development underway for the scaling piece of this one, for the multiple products that we had. As we were moving into foundry space, I've hired new talent out of the foundry companies that are existing. I was asking them about the number of products that they run. And in Arizona, where I was a factory manager prior to Ohio, we had similar number of products that were there because we were running 3 technologies in parallel. And so each of those had a product suite associated with them. Does it get even bigger as we mature the technologies and you add more customers? It does. But I think the technology piece is the easiest of this. Those that remember 200 millimeter when we used to load lots by hand know that we went to an automated material handling system. So now everything is kind of controlled. For the reticles, it'll be the same thing. That'll also be manually controlled. And in an age we talk about AI, artificial intelligence, we are not only the manufacturers of the chips that go into artificial intelligence, but we have the automation that controls our manufacturing as artificial intelligence. What I mean by that is our manufacturing execution system will think through where every single lot needs to be in the factory and how to get it to the next piece of equipment and how to land that reticle where, aligned with that particular lot and run through that one. That's probably something that from a roadmap standpoint, we're really good on. If we think about that scaling though, of the number of customers that we have, in my mind, the bigger challenge as I've gone through the learning of being, a manufacturer and a foundry, I think one of my big learnings the last few years is that we are a customer service organization. And so how do you treat all of those customers like they are the most special, only customer in the world on the planet? And to be able to scale that way for the interface to get them the data that they want, to get them their customization that they want, I think that's an even bigger challenge for us that we are facing or addressing right now.
Intel has announced this catch-up strategy of 5 nodes in 4 years. I can imagine a large increase in x86 product roadmap line items. More nodes faster would seem to drive more products. Tell us about your 5 and 4 game plans. Are the factory and the product design teams working together to simplify the roadmap? Does a proliferation of product line items help you achieve world-class node performance as you were just discussing?
Yeah, so this is really good. I'm happy to report, we talk about 5 nodes in 4 years, and we are on track to do that. We had to do 5 nodes in 4 years to catch up. Now, let me put things in terms of the terms that the alumni would be around for, to kind of do the math on the 5 nodes in 4 years, because what's old is new again in terms of we talking TikTok. For those who've been around a long time, remember Tick was, brand new major architecture. Talk was, brand new major process node, but you would do derivatives in between, and it was every 2 years. So if
Yeah.
you look at the 5 nodes that are existing, that they're broken up into two of the separate nodes in the middle there, Intel 4 and Intel 3, would it be a major process node, all new tooling in a different set of factories, and then you would customize that again in Intel 3. Same thing as you go from Intel 20A to Intel 18A. So you can then take that and split that up and have different factories that are running the 18A, 28 combo, Intel 4, Intel 3 combo. And of course, we have our Intel 7 that's running in multiple factories today. So that dividing up of the work on the factory side is pretty easy to do. There are some parts of our business that has to kind of service all of that. Mention the product groups, as well as, let's say, the mask operations. So a couple of years ago, we doubled our mask operation capacity by opening another site in Oregon. So yes, it's a challenge for us, but it's necessary to do, and we're executing well on it.
Super. Help me understand how much investment funding by Intel and the industry will be required to develop this geographically diverse semiconductor equipment supply chain. What are we going to do to make sure that Intel has the people talent to run the fabs, to develop the technology required for the new nodes, and move them into production consecutively here? I think people could be the next big story here.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you look at the market growing to 1 trillion, if you look at the fact that across all of the different, even outside of Intel, big project announcements, whether it's Intel in Ohio and Arizona, there's so much growth that's going to happen in investment that it does come down to people. And if you look at some of the latest semi reports that are out there, it says that we're going to grow 115,000 jobs by the end of the decade. Now, here's the scary part. That same report actually said that 76,000 of those could be potentially unfilled. So Intel has taken an approach that, hey, talent can slow us down even as quickly as building space can. Let's invest. And as an example, in Ohio, we committed $50 million into the education system, and we've already put $17.7 million out there for 80 different institutions across Ohio, because we need to develop and cultivate that the talent pipeline. So we're working on that now.
Fantastic. Chris, I got a question for you. In reading Chip Wars, you cite 2 examples of governments trying to create homegrown industries to compete in semiconductors. One in China, one in Russia. Both failed. Industries built by governments often fail because of government. The China and Russia initiatives happened while the US government was much less involved in the semiconductor industry in the last 40 years than they were in the first 10 years in the early Minuteman days. How do we protect our government from failing in the next era when they seem to be signaling a desire to be more hands-on in funding with an enormous increase in complexity here?
Well, thanks for the question. I think it's a critical challenge that the government faces, because on the one hand, there's no doubt that government has repeatedly played a role in defining the direction the chip industry goes. And that's true from the Minuteman days. It's true from the invention of FinFET transistors. There were government involvement at every step in that process. But it's also true that it's companies, not governments, that make semiconductor manufacturing profitable. It's also true that it's companies, not governments, that understand where demand is and how to meet it profitably and efficiently. And so I think governments need to be very, very careful in the role that they try to play. If you look at China right now, which is investing as much money in its chip industry from government funds as the rest of the world combined, I think it's roughly 1 CHIPS Act per year of funding that goes into the Chinese chip industry. The CHIPS Act in the US will play out over half a decade. What you find is that although the impact of that massive sum of money is real, the return on investment of every dollar that China spent is very bad. I think the Chinese state has been one of the worst venture capital firms in the history of the entire technology industry. And I don't think the US should try to repeat that. However, I think it's also true that until recently, other governments were being quite generous with their semiconductor industries in a way the US was not. And indeed, there's an extraordinary study that was assembled in 2019 by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which measured the amount of government funds that different chip firms from different countries received. And one of its findings was that there were US companies that received more money in manufacturing subsidies from other governments than from the United States. And so in that context, it's not hard to understand why many companies made decisions to build factories in other countries. And so I think if you look at the CHIPS Act today at the highest level, what the US government's trying to do is to level a playing field that right now is very unlevel. And I think that's a role that we can feel relatively comfortable for governments playing, even though I completely agree with the spirit of the question that we should be very cautious about having governments play any more of a hands-on role.
Thanks. And at this point, I'm going to switch to questions from the audience, okay? And Al, you're up first. I have a question from Omar Sadat. Companies or industrial sectors that are closely linked to government funding, defense and aerospace, for example, are often inefficient since they're forced to optimize solely for securing government funds. What will the impact be on Intel's long-term competitiveness as we embark on a strategy of increasing government engagement?
I believe positive. To kind of build off of what Chris just said, I think there's another dynamic that is important here, right? And if you look at, as we were talking about Moore's Law, and basically now the three companies that can make a leading edge chip, you're down to also three countries, right? It's the United States, it's Taiwan, and it's Korea. And so I think the way the CHIPS Act was structured, where you're really talking about leveraging a massive investment tax credit and also specific grants to incentivize, is the right balance that allows us to basically maintain our commerciality without basically going through what I would, coming from a defense company, some of the laborious processes it takes to basically buy things in the defense world. And so I don't think, I think if we're going to rebalance the supply chain, a public-private partnership with the government is going to be required. And I think we've struck the right balance at doing that in multiple parts across the world.
Next, Stu, we have a question from Cliff Perkhauser. For us alumni who were at Intel during Andy Grove era, a common question is, why did Intel lose its leadership status in the 21st century? Was Andy just an exceptional leader and his successors were not able to follow?
I think it's a great question. As I think some of the folks on the call know today, I'm back from my second tour of duty. I left Intel in 2014 to go run manufacturing HP for a number of years, then came back to help Pat rebuild the processes and the approaches we used to make the company successful back during the Grove era. I think there are a couple things that, in reflection on this question, which I also get asked a lot, we made some fundamentally bad choices, and it only takes a few really bad strategic choices to alter the strategic destiny of the company. One of the things that Chris talks about in his book is, although we were a pioneer in EUV, we had the first investment in ASML, we decided to go a different direction. And you remember the debate over 450 millimeter wafers versus 300 millimeter wafers. And I remember the meeting where that decision was made, and just we lost out on an opportunity. And I think that, combined with a lack of what really made us successful in terms of focus, Chris talks about in his book with TSMC, their singular focus on cost. And Moore's Law, in many ways, is a law about economics. And as we look at where we're at today, we have to strive to get cost out of these products in order to make doubling the number of transistors an affordable economic option. So a couple of bad decisions. One that Paul Otellini admitted to, publicly to the Alumni Network, was the decision not to do the Apple iPhone, based on the fact that we didn't think we could be cost competitive. And two was the decision not to go after EUV very heavily And then third decision was getting into businesses that we didn't frankly have a place to be in. Drones, clothes, yeah, they're not central to changing the world. And I think with Pat's leadership and Pat's leadership and Sal's the reason I came back, is we have the focus now. We have a strategy that honors what we had, in terms of our existing PC and server business, but doesn't keep us bound to it. And that's why we're out pursuing Foundry business today with the ferocity that we're doing, because the strategy of under Grove would not work in today's world, not with TSMC and the fundamental process advantages it has and that we hope to catch up on. So different world, different strategy. I don't know if Andy would have been able to quite manage his way through that. Imagine the conversation Carl we had with Andy and said, hey, look, Andy, we want to do a different architecture today. We think that's the right thing to go do. And we're going to open up all of our factories. I don't know if Andy would have been able to, do well with that conversation. I'm sure we'd have a pretty Grovian debate about it. But I think now Pat's faced the fundamental realities of where we're at as a company. He's, promoting this IDM 2.0 strategy that we all, I think, fundamentally believe in. And it's starting to, bear the fruit. And as we get more and more confidence in our approaches with Foundry customers, I think you'll see this play out in a dramatic new way for the company and its customers, its employees, its stockholders.
Jim, I'm going to come back to you in just a second because Chris has a flight to catch and will have to leave here at 5 o'clock Eastern, I believe. So, Chris, I've got one final question from the audience for you to field today. It's from Milt Walker. He says, after reading Chip War, an enjoyable and insightful read, it was hard to miss the fingerprints of U.S. industrial policy on the storyline. It seems we may be at a similar inflection point with respect to the industry. Do you see an important differing factors from the past that might drive different strategies from Andy Grove's trade-off between RAM and CPU?
I spent a lot of time trying to understand Andy Grove's thinking in the 1980s when that trade-off was being made. And I think one of the things that was really striking was the extent to which he talked about the decision to pivot away from memory as an emotionally wrenching decision, that he'd helped build the company around producing memory chips. One of his executive team members described the decision to pivot away from memory as like Ford deciding not to manufacture cars. It was that much of a cultural shift. It was seen that way to Grove and many people around him. I'd be interested to hear whether others on this call would echo those sentiments. But what I think he fundamentally got right was that there was in the memory business a pathway to continue a competition that was not really winnable. You could keep pouring money into the memory business, but the competition was both tough and headed in a direction that was not going to be profitable for the company. There were too many players in the memory business. There was no way to differentiate a competitive edge. And instead, the brilliance of the strategy was to focus on a type of semiconductor where there was far less competition and far more scope for growth. And that was the microprocessor and CPU. And so I think that has actually real lessons for today, because on the one hand, the industry, Intel in particular, but the entire industry is focused on the competitions that we're in right now. And those are important competitions for every company to want to win. But actually, the thing that Andy Grove did really well was to understand when to leave a market that wasn't going to be profitable and pivot to something entirely different, even when it felt like it was in some ways a rejection of the heritage of the Intel that he'd helped build over the course of the 1970s and early 1980s. And so reading the letters and the memos that he wrote at the time and his interviews from that time, you get a sense of the emotion that was involved in that shift. But fundamentally, it was the right shift to make, even though it involved such massive changes at Intel at the time. And I think for every semiconductor company, but perhaps also for Intel right now, there's echoes of that, of big changes in the way of doing business that have to be undertaken, that are hard, controversial, emotionally, as well as institutionally. But nevertheless, that's how technology companies have to pivot when technology begins to change.
Well said. Well said. And we appreciate your time today and spending the time with Intel employees and alumni. We look forward to having you back again sometime, and we look forward to the next book too that Pat mentioned. I can't wait to get a copy.
Well, thank you. It was an honor to join you today.
Our pleasure. Jim, I'm going to come back to you. We have a question from Chandra Baranowski, pardon me for the mispronunciation. Will newer manufacturing equipment, scanners, etc., ever become so expensive that Intel or that the total available market of semiconductors can't stand multiple profitable foundries?
I love this question because before I was a factory manager, I was a litho department manager, and lithography is staggering. The fact that you could have a piece of tooling now reaching around a quarter B is like unbelievable. And so let me answer it in two different ways. One is that investment that's required absolutely has an impact on companies. We've had consolidation in the industry because of the fact that the investment that's required, today only 3 companies in logic can do that, right? TSMC, Samsung, and Intel. And now what I do think though is that there will always be a need for 2 companies because customers are going to want an option, but there's no entitlement for the third. So we have to be hungry to be in that top 2 and reach that by the end of the decade. Now, the question asked about the total available, if we ever get to the point where it's so expensive you can't do that, what there I'm going to pivot to, really, it's more of a question on, do you believe in Moore's Law? That, because again, back to what Stu was talking about, Moore's Law being an economic law as well. So part of the engineering is not just the technology, but it'll be the economics for it. And today, if you look at it in foundry space, it's a good margin business, 60%. So there's a lot of room to be able to invest and be able to develop that one, not only from a technology standpoint, but to make sure that the economics work. So I think we will always have the technology moving forward, but we're not entitled to have 3 companies. So we better earn that business.
Correct. Al, the next question comes your way. It's from Dan Netta. Why do you think the U.S. government is so visible in its support of TSMC, including visiting the CEO in Taiwan? What we need is doubling down on U.S. companies to ramp domestic production.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one, as they've gotten more educated about the industry, I think they recognize the significance that Taiwan has, right? And as you're looking at, policy related to China, I think they want to be supportive there. I think the other is, look, TSMC is making an investment in the United States, and I think it's very difficult for any U.S. policymaker or one at the state to say, you could build your factories anywhere, but you chose my state or my country, and so I don't want to support that. I think in a lot of ways, and Pat's spoken about this, we expect that as with the foreign direct investment from both TSMC in Arizona and Samsung in Texas, that they should receive some support. With that said, I think if you look at what we've done and in relation to the CHIPS Act, we are doubling down to ramp up domestic production. I first met Jim Evers in Arizona. Jim is now in Ohio, right? I think the fact that we're packaging in New Mexico, not insignificant. And I think as we start to share more publicly what we're likely to do in Oregon, we are doing that. The other thing, I'll just tell one quick story because I know there's always a lot of questions that I get about TSMC. So in this year's State of the Union, we generally get an advance copy and kind of get a sense of the guests that the president invites to who they want to speak about. And in this case, it was a supplier who was in Arizona who is basically going to be supporting the eventual TSMC fabs. So we were ready for it. It's going to be interesting to watch how the president addressed it. Well, the president didn't address it. He basically recreated and spoke about Ohio and basically talked about the investment that we're making there. And so I get why, for a whole host of reasons, diplomatic and frankly, given their investment, why they will want to put a positive engagement with TSMC. But I think when it comes to support, I feel pretty good where we're at.
Stu, the next audience question comes your way from Link Belt. With advanced with advanced packaging developing in the semiconductor ecosystem, are we witnessing a technology shift similar to what Logic saw with the advent of 300 millimeter?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think in some ways, just like orange is the new black from the TV show, packaging is the new litho. Jim mentioned earlier the cost of litho is skyrocketing. It certainly is. And as a result, our customers are looking at ways to package, if you will, systems on a chip of systems. So think about PCI Express. It was a standard that we created in 1995. It's a bus architecture that allowed you to plug different cards into a PC backplane. That added tremendous value to the PC ecosystem, allowed companies like NVIDIA, for example, to build a whole graphics business around it. What's happening now in the chip business is we are adding bus architectures right on the chip itself. So just like we had PCIe, now we have a technology called UCIe, Universal Chip Interconnect Express. And that technology is allowing us to mix and match chips from different semiconductor manufacturers into a single package. And that's where advanced packaging really comes to play, because when you look at the devices that are powering the AI revolution, devices like the H100 from NVIDIA, these are massive dies with a lot of memory around it. And what the industry is going to move to is breaking those dies up, just like we did with Meteor Lake, making them smaller, getting better yields out of them, and then gluing them together on a single system. This is usually important, for example, for the military industrial complex, that they want the ability to mix and match. And so we're going to build, a set of ODM partners, call them silicon ODM partners, just like we had, probably you'll remember the PC ODM partners in Taiwan, where they would build all these systems and mix and match. That same phenomenon is going to happen in the silicon side of the business, and it'll be on the basis of advanced packaging and standards like UCIe that Intel is fundamentally involved in driving and creating. So you're going to see us make significant investments. As Al mentioned, one of our U.S. government grant packages we've submitted for is for New Mexico, and that's solely for advanced packaging, because we think it's that important to be able to mix and match different technologies so we can, hopefully get into more of TSMC's business, but also to give our customers a lot more flexibility.
Okay. Jim, next question is from Alejandro Mota. Are U.S. semiconductor manufacturing facilities moving closer to home to countries like Mexico after the supply chain disruption we just lived through with COVID?
Yeah, I would say COVID for sure put every company on notice to look through their supply chain. So that was absolutely true, that, from a supply chain standpoint, every company is looking at that one and being strategic about where that goes. Now, when I say closer to home, obviously it depends upon where your customers are and that supply chain location. If you think about Mexico, though, being close to the United States, one of the questions I always get asked is why Ohio? And I'll answer the Mexico question by answering, the Ohio question, which is it has to have the infrastructure that we need. We use a lot of power, water, all of those facilities. It has to have access to the talent as well. And so we have the Midwest network that is very, very close by. And so some of those things may not be, there when we think about automobile companies that could go down to, Mexico and have their, supply chain needs met. That's not quite the same case, I would say, for the, advanced semiconductors. So yes, every supply chain has to be looked at, but I think the domestic things that you see, the European investment, making sure that, all the check boxes are there, or why you see the announcements that you do.
Okay. Al, we have a question from Michelle Galvaneski. How do we battle China's protectionism, including the SMAR, State Administration of Market Regulations, refusals of mergers?
So I'll try my best to answer that, because I think it's, I wouldn't call it necessarily the protectionism. I think the one thing that our ELT and a lot of members of the government affairs team spend a lot of their time thinking through and working on is the geopolitical tension between China and the United States. And the one industry that is right at the center of it is the semiconductor industry. And so I think we are working, leveraging our our expertise and our talent to kind of talk to both governments and explain kind of why there's a way to ensure that the interest of both countries are met. I think, but right now the challenge is it's not necessarily a battle for protectionism. I think it's a continued education effort with government to understand the roles that markets play, and in particular, speaking from the U.S. vantage point, I think it's showing the key role that the Chinese market plays and Intel's ability to continue to do greater R&D and manufacturing investments in the United States. And so, because there's definitely some tension points and some disagreements, you will have things that are impacted on that, hence mergers and acquisitions. But I think over time, if we're successful, I think we'll get both governments to a place to where I think they can see the benefit of the markets and how it serves the interest of both nations.
Super. Stu from Wolfgang, what role do you think RISC-V will play in the future, and how should a company like Intel position itself on RISC-V?
Well, RISC-V is an open source standard for microprocessor architectures. As such, it's a little bit, the wild, wild west. People are incorporating RISC-V technologies in different ways. But I think for us right now, our focus is to stay abreast of what's going on with that architectural approach, which is, by the way, very prominent in China today, because China wants the ability to open source architectures and build whatever they want. But there isn't one unifying standard for it, the same way there was with x86, or in fact with ARM, because ARM would collect all this IP standards together and create an architecture with it. Our focus right now, at least from an IFS point of view, is to really closely partner with ARM, because that is, as I mentioned earlier, 80% of the volume that TSMC runs today is with an ARM-based processor. That's not true for RISC-V. So we'll monitor RISC-V closely as a software effort to see how much traction it gets. We certainly don't want to be blind to the fact that it may make dramatic progress over the coming years because it offers a fundamentally different economic model. But our focus today will be on ARM for the Foundry business, obviously x86 for our regular business units, for servers, for NEX, and for clients. So we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll watch software advances. But that's, I think, about as far as we'll go.
The next question is for Jim from Michael Edwards. The TSMC factory in Arizona has recently been delayed. How do you see this playing out in the coming months? What does this mean for Intel's capacity profile?
Yeah, okay, so TSMC Arizona has a very particular interest for me because early on when they were there, we lost some of our colleagues to them, and some of those colleagues are back now at Intel. And so I'm hoping on the broader scale, I read things about limitations to TSMC's capacity at 2 nanometer, 3 nanometer nodes. And so if we're here about chip wars, each fab is like the army that you send. And so they have stuff in Taiwan, but the reserve army is now pushed out in Arizona by a year. So hopefully that gives Stu and the team a window where customers might be coming and looking at us. Now, the other way to look at this, though, is to go, okay, they are new to the Arizona site. And my brothers and sisters in Arizona, we never had a 1-year delay that we would have put on, the trades or talent or things like that. Never had that. So in that same place, we've always been able to execute. Now coming to Ohio, though, I think of it differently. I'm the new kid in town in Ohio, or we're going to have a new one in Germany. And we need to think with humbleness about these lessons that TSMC is having and struggling in Arizona, and how that will play out as we have the new greenfields coming up. What is it about our ecosystems that we need to, build the partnerships that we need? And so I know one of our OKRs is to build education in the region as a very positive. We're very engaged with the trade companies, and I think we're approaching it the right way. But we do need to be humble that there is a lesson that when you come into a new part of town, not everything goes as smoothly as you think.
Al, Amy Moore writes, the U.S. economy is traditionally a capitalist economy with money driving decisions in publicly owned companies. With an inherent difference in the cost of labor manufacturing between the U.S. and Asia, is it too optimistic to expect that semiconductor companies will be willing to pay more to get semiconductors manufactured in the U.S.?
No, and I'll say no for two reasons. First, the CHIPS and Science Act, particularly the major incentives, were really designed to address the cost gap between the United States and other geographic locations. I think the second thing is, I'd say is COVID. And I know Stu has an amazing career in supply chains, and I cut my teeth as a civilian in government doing supply chain policy in Congress. And what you saw for decades from the time the shipping container really got introduced was everything about the supply chain was about efficiency and just-in-time delivery. And then COVID showed up. And I think, Pat frequently, one of the arguments he used for people who, for members of Congress who would ask a similar question is, we've now gone from just-in-time, just in case. And I think because you have to have greater resiliency, people are going to pay for that. And I do think there is a concern about, Taiwan's just geography in the world. And you could argue the same with South Korea, where it's not that people will not manufacture and use TSMC or Samsung, but you don't necessarily want to have all your eggs in that basket, and you're willing to pay a little bit more, I think, to have a diversity in your supply chain, just because COVID and the following shortage was so disruptive. You just don't want to put yourself at risk again for that.
Stu, we have a question from Aaron Zhang. What do you think Intel needs to do to be a leader again? What do you think our competitors do well that Intel needs to improve and work on?
Well, when I first joined Intel back in 1981 as a junior sales guy, I think, Carl, you were regional manager in Dallas back then, the slogan of the company was Intel delivers. And I think, for us to be successful in foundry business, to us to be a great partner in our classic businesses of, client, server, and networking, we have to keep executing. And we've started to execute again, especially in the last year. You've seen us not slip product schedules, get products out on time, execute on 5 nodes in 4 years, make our financial commitments. All those things are necessary. We just have to get back to that culture of execution. And I think in the last several quarters, we've gone a long way to getting that back. I think the other thing is, it's a different world now in that we have fabulous competitors like AMD, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, working with TSMC in partnership. And so for us to be competitive in our mainstream businesses, we have to get back to process leadership. And we're doing a lot of benchmarking work to understand what do we need to do better? How can we do better? And just to give you some ideas of what is coming on the horizon, the new process that we're using for the majority of our foundry business, the process we call 18A, has a new transistor technology on it called gate-all-around, and it has a new process on the backside of the wafer called backside metallization, which allows better power delivery. Intel does really well when we execute on new innovations in process technology, things like new transistor architectures or new recipes. And we are right on the verge of doing that. And the initial feedback that we're getting on this new process technology has been outstanding. So get that in production, ramp it the way we always do, honor our commitments, do great products in PC, servers, and networking. And I think the answer is simple. All we have to do is execute. We know what our competitors do well. They have been executing. We know how to be successful with great process technology. And now with the foundry opportunity in front of us, we can expand that business. So I feel good about our chances, but we still have a ways to go. We got to go knock it out and get back to process leadership in 2025 so we can do all these things and regain our rightful competitive position. Now, I will point out, because we used to always talk about market segment share, Carl, when you're back at Intel and also at Dell, we have returned in the client business back to historical market segment share levels. We are back in the mid 80s again. Why? Because we executed. We're not there yet on servers, but I think with parts like Sapphire Rapids and Granite Rapids getting pulled in, we'll get back there too. So there are lots of signs of, encouragement emerging this year that I think we can all be proud of.
Well, Stuart, I'm certainly proud of you and the progress you've made since you joined the company in sales. And I think it's no coincidence that you spent a long winter's night with two of the best sales representatives the company ever had, locked in the Henry Ford Museum, snowed in. That would be Bob Noyce and Mike Martin. So your skills have been based upon their wisdom, and you're doing really great with them.
Yeah, I had great tutors, you among them, so I'm very grateful for that.
So Jim, the next question from David Galis. With the sustained tremendous increase in annual semiconductor production rates, is there a role companies should be taking on related to semiconductor recycling? How is the industry addressing this today and other environmental concerns?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll connect it back to actually the talent question that we had, because it's one of the slides that I love to share in the colleges, and I think it resonates for them, which is our RISE goal. RISE to be responsible, inclusive, sustainable, and enabling. And something that every alum and every Intel employee could be proud of is that we are a leader in sustainability. And I would encourage people to go read the sustainability report. And we've been that way for a while. We were one of the leaders in the reduction of conflict-free minerals. Last year, we were able to get the U.S. to net zero on the water, to 100% reuse on the water. We set an audacious goal for 2040 to get to zero greenhouse gases. So absolutely, as we go through it, there's a lot of resources that we use. Intel has thought through how do we be a sustainable company and be a leader in that particular space. So.
Great. Well, I'm going to have, I think we got time for one more round of questions for the panel here before we wrap up the event today. And I think I'll just pose one question and have you each respond to it. Everybody has read Chip War, okay? And we all have different takeaways about Chip War and about what it means and what it could do. Just briefly give your opinion of what Chip War example or issue means the most to you as you think about doing your job in the next year at Intel. And I'll start with Al.
So for me, it's industrial policy, but also the law of unintended consequences. One of the things in the book I found very interesting was in the late 1980s when the Japanese were really making significant progress and taking a dominant position on memory chips, and the U.S. government used tariffs to basically try to combat that. And one of the effects of that was it created the opportunity for the Koreans to basically become a powerhouse in semiconductor manufacturing. And so part of the thing that we are trying to do as we're working through this implementation is not to also make sure that the government understands chips is about manufacturing and incentivizing it, but it's also about U.S. technological leadership. And I think that we don't want the leadership position to be sacrificed sometimes, I think, in some of the names of manufacturing. So there's a balance there. But the one thing that I took away from the book was not just the involvement of the government, but the law of unintended consequences. And we're spending our time to try to think about what those are and to try to make sure that we're not a victim of it.
Right. Stu?
Well, for me, the book was fascinating that it documented the story of Morris Chang and how he built TSMC. And the way Morris ran TSMC reminded me a lot of the way Andy ran Intel. This focus, this passion for innovation. But in Morris's case, his focus was on cost and the ability to get more cost out of semiconductors than probably any other person on the planet. And I think that renewed my focus on the leadership team in terms of making sure that we focus on manufacturing cost. And we are, taking that opportunity to improve our productivity every day, every week, every month, every year. only by doing that are going to be able to maintain our leadership position. So I think that story, I think, is instrumental to all of us, especially in this brave new world of IDM 2.0, where we're expected to compete against TSMC, as a foundry competitor, and they set the benchmark for customer support, customer service, and productivity. And to beat them effectively, we have to match or exceed what they do today, or we will not be successful.
Okay. Jim?
Yeah, as I was picking up my copy of the book and getting ready for this one, because I read it a year ago, there was a little bookmark on page 220. And it was the section where Morris Chang comes back because he thinks the guy that's in charge isn't investing enough. Right. And so then he goes off and invests and TSMC grows and it's a really, really wonderful customer. In Chip Wars 2.0, that same storyline hopefully will be attributed to Pat Gelsinger for all the different investments that he's made. Now, what's interesting, though, is as we add, Ohio, Germany, Poland, all these new places, is that the only thing worse than not having capacity, I was in 14 nanometers struggling with output max, and then there was another fab ready to be there, have an unfilled fab, right? And it's really, really hard on the P&L. So there's a balance to be able to make all this work. But I think we have the absolute right approach. I was around for Jerry Parker's always have one shell available. And I think we were making the right call to get that capacity in place with smart capacity and optimize our costs. So that's what I think about every day is, all right, how do we get the stuff up and running? And then how do we get it filled?
Super. Well, hey, it's been a great event. And once again, I want to thank the panelists for their participation today. And I want to remind all the Intel employees that you are and will continue to be at the center of the computer industry. In addition, your alumni are your biggest fans. Thank you for your attendance today, and we hope to see you again.